I think we first have to start, first off, thanks to all the speakers that came up and presented today, and then also a big thanks to 4 people in particular who were instrumental to putting this event on and really put in a lot of work, and that's Chris Beck, Jamie Partridge, Grant Booth, and Ryan. If we can give them all a big hand. They put So I'm going to talk about the student movement here in Portland, and especially about 2 events that happened pretty close together. And it's exciting to read about Portland history. I realize I haven't done a lot of that, and I think it's actually really important when I start reading about it. Like there's a way in which we are made to believe that the history of this country is a history of apathy, and that things have been improving by themselves. And actually, the way that things have been getting better is actually through mass amounts of struggle from people from below in this country, and the continued struggle that is happening. And there's a really rich history here in Portland that I'm just starting to learn about. I picked up this book, The Portland Guide, the Portland Red Guide. But there was, in 1970 is what I'm going to talk about, and this was really the pinnacle of the radicalization that had happened throughout the 60s. The civil rights movement had been transformed into the Black Power movement. The Black Panther Party was building chapters all over the country, including right here in Portland. There was a health clinic that was opened up. There was the breakfast program that was also happening here in Portland, and there was also a huge anti-war movement, a lot of it that was centered on campuses. And in 1970, Nixon was president, and he had announced an expansion of the war in Vietnam into Cambodia, actually. And this prompted a huge amount of struggle across the country by student activists. At this point, Students for Democratic Society was an organization that had hundreds of thousands of students, right, that considered themselves revolutionaries, that thought we needed to overthrow capitalism and put in a different system. The Black Panther Party had hundreds of thousands and actually had a newspaper that was sold around the country and sold hundreds of thousands on a monthly basis around as well. And Portland was a part of this, actually. In particular, I want to talk about, obviously, the draft was a big deal, right? And a lot of young people were being drafted to go to war, to kill other working class and oppressed people. And there was a real struggle to actually resist that draft. And I'm going to read here from the Portland Red Guide. In February 1970, the SDS and the Student Mobilization Committee had organized anti-military recruiting demonstrations at PSU, which culminated with about 20 students had surrounded 2 U.S. Navy recruiters in the Smith Memorial Union. 4 of them, Maureen Gray, Liana Fenyo, and Lynn Meyer and Dan Wolf, made sure the recruiters left the building. And I was reading another article about it. Actually, what had happened was they had forced them out of the Smith Hall, and actually they had ran over to Lincoln Hall and locked themselves inside of a room. And actually more people came to protest, according to this other account. And eventually there were like bricks thrown in through the window as well. But these 4 students ended up being expelled from the university, despite a lot of the efforts of their lawyers. But that didn't stop the movement against the war, and what it culminated in was, so this had happened in February, is when the demonstrations happened against the war recruiters. But in early May, and this is when President Nixon ordered U.S. troops to expand the Vietnam War by publicly invading Cambodia, spontaneous protests broke out all over the nation, during which 4 students were killed by National Guard troops at Kent State University in Ohio, and 2 by police at Jackson State University in Mississippi. And there were protests all around the country. And in Portland, on May 6th, Portland State University students and the faculty actually called for a strike. and went out. And basically, they closed down the campus for 4 days. They gathered into park lots, and demonstrators actually called out and persuaded a whole bunch of other students and community to come support the strike. And they blocked traffic with barricades that they built from the park benches that were there in the park lots at PSU, and from other debris from construction sites there. And the Oregon governor at the time, Tom McGall, had ordered the reopening of the university. But protesters then refused when the police tried to take down a first aid tent. And there was a lot of camping out, apparently, in front of there. And police came dressed in riot gear and attacked the protesters in wedge formation with clubs. Almost 30 protesters were injured seriously enough to be hospitalized in what became known as the Battle of the Park Blocks. And the university and the community around it actually came out in support and in outrage against the attack by the police against the protesters. And more than 5,000 Portlanders marched to City Hall to demand the organizers of the police riot, the city commissioner Francis Avanci and the police chief Donald McNamara, be punished for their actions. So that's a little bit of Portland history. And it wasn't just struggles against the Vietnam War or against racism. Students were actually beginning to draw radical conclusions about the way this society needed to be organized, and in particular, how the universities needed to be organized. I'm going to really quickly read a little bit of the obituary of one organizer. His name was Bill Nygren. And he actually, well, the obituary tells his story, so I'll just read from there. Bill M. Nygren, the first draft resistor in Oregon, died at his Oregon home this last July at the age of 68. Mr. Nygren was an independent scholar and writer and a political organizer in the San Francisco Bay Area and Portland. He was the youngest professional sports writer and broadcaster in Portland, Oregon in the mid-60s. When the Newspaper Guild strikers from the Oregonian started an alternative newspaper, the Portland Reporter, Mr. Nygren was on board and was told by the Oregonian management he would never work in mainstream media again because of his activities, and he never did. He was one of a dozen Portland State political activists investigated by the U.S. House Un-American Activities Committee in 1964 and 1965. Bill served as the editor of the Portland State University student newspaper, The Vanguard. He introduced innovations, placing key editorials about state education funding issues, Joe Uris's student body president endorsement, and the Vietnam War, occasionally on the front page. Through Bill Nygren's editorship, The Vanguard received the coveted National Scholastic Press Association's All-American Award. And in 1970, he was actually writing, he wrote about the Vietnam War, in opposition to the Vietnam War, but he also wrote about the ways in which students and faculty can actually democratize the university and what real education would actually look like in a society that wasn't driven by profit, but a society that was driven by human need, and a society that didn't erase the histories of people. And I'm just going to really quickly, with the time that I have left, read this editorial that he had written for the PSU Vanguard. And the title of the editorial is "Escape Possible from PSU." Let's look a little more closely at the university, the trap that kills reality by training the student to develop zest for his job or technique and indifference to its purpose. Reality is denied through ideology. The assumptions of that ideology are that all industrialized societies possess the same basic characteristics. Therefore, it's fruitless for man to reject those imperatives. Man cannot transform society. All conflict is reconcilable and concerns a fatality or a frailty of the social order in general, not a structural or class contradiction. A status quo ideology is taught because the university is a status quo institution. Research and graduate school money come from the government and private, family-controlled foundations. Today they come from corporations as well.
That's right.
The bulk of the money goes to the elite schools. The bulk of the money goes to elite schools, which enjoy intellectual hegemony in America. It is there that our culture, social dynamics, and history are interpreted and transmitted to the hinterlands. By and large, elite school graduates will run or rationalize the society, either as owners, top management, or court scribes and aides. State university grads will become teachers, lower-level lawyers, lower-level executives, and civic employees. Community college grads are shunted into minor clerical or shop work, dead-end careers. Family income, not intelligence, is the prime factor in school channeling. Another turn of the screw. Effective in 1970, a class-biased enrollment ceiling will be placed on four-year institutions in Oregon. In addition, tuition is increased biannually. And if we look back at what it was then to compare to how much it's increased, and another increase at PSU is coming up very soon. And actually the Portland Student Union is organizing a protest on March 12th to yet again challenge those tuition increases. The power apparatus is thus saying to the average working taxpayer whose disposable income is declining that while he carries a disproportionate load of taxation, his children will have less and less chance in obtaining a four-year education. It's well known that student government works in such a narrowly circumscribed framework that it has absolutely no power. It's up to us to divert the energies of this. Student government is set up to divert the energies of the civic-minded student into harmless outlets. Some hope student government might begin to build a popular movement. As Bacon said, hope is a good breakfast, but a lean supper. How? By fighting for a student-controlled, fully credited experimental college whose purpose would be to challenge the prevailing ideology and course structure and to let students work for change in the community as part of the learning process. By forming a statewide union of 2 four-year students, no longer letting the system play us off against one another. A four-year student's public subsidy is over $1,000 higher than his two-year student brother or sisters. This would require turning education over to the people, not by placing a couple of student government persons on the phony state board, but by gaining actual control for minorities, faculty, students, working people, and college staff.
Oh yeah.
Yes, indeed.
By fighting racism and social and sexual oppressions. Count the minority students. They don't match population ratios. This would necessitate an open enrollment policy, state-level community projects, a free daycare center, a bolstered tutorial program, and ending wage discrimination against female teachers, staff, and work-study students.
Woo.
By demanding that all school policies be put in accord with the needs of what might be called the worker-student minorities constituency, in short, the people. By demanding the library balance its books. Look at the shelves carrying works on Russia, China, the Middle East, etc. They're mostly CIA recipient Prager books, giving us the same old commie scare status quo jive. Those are just a few parts of a constituency-oriented program. It's doubtful student government will quit kissing ass long enough to develop issues. Thus, the responsibility for change lies with other students and faculty groups. I was sitting down and I was having a conversation, and it turns out that there's a person here that was actually involved in the 1970s student strike and that struggle. So if everybody can welcome Jody to the stage, she's going to talk a little bit.
Hey.
I read Dan wrote an article from the Vietnam veterans in the street group saying that during the 60s, Portland didn't appreciate the veterans. And I disagree with that. I think we should talk about it.
I didn't say that.
It's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as we were concerned, I was at the Portland State in the late 60s, and a pacifist from Eugene, whose name I can't remember, and I founded the Portland Committee Against the War in Vietnam at Portland State.
Woo! Yeah!
We were inspired by the civil rights movement, of course. And so one of the first things we did was march down Broadway Street. Like 30 of us. There's somebody on the roof with a rifle, you know. But anyway, what happened was the students from Portland State started marching. And then the professors, like sociology and those kind of professors, they came really on strong. And then came the high school students, and from Lewis and Clark and Reed, some professors and students came. And then it grew and grew, because we kept marching down Broadway Street. And anyway, and then SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, came to town and really increased our numbers, and we got larger. And and then the unions joined us, and we got bigger and bigger, and that was very encouraging. And then the veterans, and when the veterans came, that made all the difference in the world. We were like thousands marching down the street. We got so big. Governor recalled one of us not to be around when the American Legion convention came to Portland. We might get in their way, so he organized that park thing where they could
Vortex 1.
Vortex,
Yes,
like Woodstock, where they could go play music and camp, which was, you know, really sold us out. And so that was what I remember from Portland State. We had a table down in Smith Center constantly, and I brought our biggest seller, which was how the U.S. got involved in Vietnam, by Shear. Also, you know, feminism was bubbling up, and women's studies came on campus, black studies came on campus for the first time. And Yvette Smith, I don't know if you remember her, she formed the very effective alternatives for prostitution, and we marched down the street, taking back the street at night. And also Betty, what's her name, Bonnie Tinker, formed the first domestic
Right, yes.
violence in the country, in Portland. And let's see, I guess that's about it.
Good. Yeah.